Chapter 1. Baker. Candlestick Manor loomed above me. I stood before the enormous door, ancient. Metal bands stretched over the dark wood. It could have been ornamental, but it wasn't. Like the latch, the small barred window in the center of the door, the inset windows with decorative grillwork all around the bottom story, yeah. No, those weren't decorative either. This place was a fortress and I was about to step inside and face a whole slew of butchers like the butcher. Holding my hand, I glanced over at Orion. His dark brown eyes were serious, but then he smiled. And my mouth watered for chocolate. His eyes were melted milk chocolate, his hair the darkest fudge, his skin white whipped cream with just a dash of mocha. He was enormous, a good head and a half above me, his physique absolute perfection beneath the black clothing he always wore. Don't be afraid. You belong here. His voice was delicious, utterly delectable, low and purring. I took both of his hands in mine and gazed at him. Tell me what your favorite breakfast food is. I'm not going in until I know. He frowned in concentration. You ask the most difficult questions. I would have to say cream puffs, the kind you make at 3 a.m. That counts as breakfast, right? I pulled my hand away and wagged my finger at him. Listen, butcher. If I'm supposed to be your baker, I need to know the truth. No hiding things from me. Whether it's favorite breakfast foods or fairies. Now spit it out. He caught my finger and leaned closer to me, so close that I could feel his exhale on my cheek. I really don't know. When I was younger, I used to go out at night with my brother, and when we snuck back in because I wasn't supposed to be out with him, he'd make me toast and bacon with orange juice. I raised my eyebrows. Toast and bacon? I really asked for that, didn't I? You're right, you have no idea what you like. I bit my bottom lip and faced the door. I had to go in. It wasn't ever easy for him to talk about his brother. Do we knock or what? He laughed low while he reached past me, turned the handle and pushed it open. The hall beyond was enormous, gleaming polished wood with white candles lining the dark wood floor. Above, chandeliers held candles, only surely they wouldn't have actual candles. Could you say fire hazard? They're real candles. The CM takes his position seriously. I glanced at him and gave him a slight smile. Okay, we came, we saw, we can leave now, right? He pulled me in and shut the door behind me. It thudded loud and echoing through the hall. Absolutely. Just as soon as you've met the CM, eaten dinner, and talked with Landry about what you want to do. I stood there for a minute, gathering my focus as though I were about to perform a difficult floor routine. I pulled my hand out of his, wiped my palms on my black skirt and started forward. Orion fell in beside me, his long stride matking mine. Are you sure you don't want to hold my hand? I glanced at him, then forward, focusing on the floor I covered with steady, fearless steps. Do I look afraid to you? He brushed me with his arm. No. You're the bravest girl I know. Think I like holding your hand or something? I couldn't help smiling, but I had to push it away to focus. This was serious business. This was a whole world I barely understood, a whole life ahead of me that I couldn't even imagine. I had to look at this like a job interview. I was going to intern with Landry so I could be a professional baker for Orion. So I could know what I was doing the next time werewolves attacked, and all I had to beat them off were biscuits in a rolling pin. The memory of their snapping teeth, their snarls echoing off the metal cabinets of the kitchen at Calder School for Boys had me gripping my skirt for a moment before I smoothed it down. My mother had always taught me to stand up straight and show no fear. If she'd been a baker, why did she run away from that world? Why hadn't she told me about what I was explained about the energy transfer, the need I had for the energy of a strong butcher, and most importantly, the dangers of the world around me, dangers that had taken her from me? I shoved those thoughts far from my head, but I grabbed Orion's hand only for a second, squeezing his fingers hard before I walked forward once more on my own. We reached two enormous doors held open by stone gargoyles to keep out evil spirits. I walked through the door towards an enormous bonfire that leapt and flickered in the round room beyond. Candles wound around the room on shelves. Thousands of candles, but they weren't lit. Orion closed the doors behind us, then hesitated. He bowed to the room, then turned to the right while he pulled something out of his coat. It was a lighter blue and white plastic, one of the cheap kinds you get at a gas station. He lit the largest candle I'd ever seen. The flame leapt up like a sparkler, and one of the sparks caught the next. Candles slightly smaller and the next, the flame racing around and around. Sound built, a murmuring hum that started with Orion and continued. As the butchers inside the round hall made that sound, a low chanting like monastery monks. The sound echoed off the walls and inside my chest, the thrumming going on and on as the light spread from one candle to the next, hundreds of candles wrapped around the room, several shelves on top of each other. I watched the candles, craning my neck as the flame spread to the candles above the doorway. The flame wrapped around the walls twice, Orion's voice growing in volume, until at last the whole room was ablaze around the central bonfire, and every butcher stood, lending his voice to the whole. Come boys. A voice of quiet power flooded the room, cutting through the humming. Young boys started forward, ducking between the larger butchers, climbing over the tables that surrounded the bonfire. A boy came up to me and hesitated while his eyes got bigger and bigger before he turned to Orion and whispered, "Is she the one who saved the werewolves?" Orion grinned at the kid and slapped his shoulder while he glanced at me. She's my savior as well." The boy grabbed my hand and tugged me forward, away from Orion who stayed by the giant candle, smiling at me with deepest satisfaction. I kept looking at him for too long before I remembered that I wasn't some tourist. I was a baker. I belonged here. I didn't feel like I belonged there. I saw a few female butchers, Olivia, who stood staring at me with a frown while Sebastian whispered something in her ear, Maria, her friend, who gave me a stony glare. But then Francis winked at me, and the whole thing became surreal. All of these boys from school, goofy, ridiculous teens, looked different in the candlelight and the flickering bonfire. Maybe it was all the black. Maybe it was the other butchers behind them, men I'd never seen who carried themselves with dignity and readiness. That's what Orion was like. I almost looked back at him but caught myself. I was here as myself, not as his girlfriend or something. "Welcome," a butcher murmured to me as I passed. Did I know him? Yes, I sort of did. He was the blonde guy who had been here that one time Orion had come for a meeting. The first time we'd kissed. I hadn't kissed Orion in what felt like hours. I pressed my lips together and continued up the first step between the tables that circled the room. On the 6th tier, the boy led me to a group of black-clad men who had a completely different aura about them. The butchers were serious, these were deadly. Was this the assassin branch of butchers? Landry stepped out of the black figures and gave me a rough bow, the movement showing his black rolling pin tucked into his coat. Was it metal or stone? Spikes? Violetta Tancetta. Welcome to the Bakers Guild. I tried not to look surprised at the grim-looking bunch with their weaponized rolling pins who nodded at me seriously. I recognized Puffer, my uncle's baker, in the back, giving me one of those nods beneath a terrifying scowl that made his usual expression positively docile. Thanks. I forgot my rolling pin. Landry smiled, showing his white teeth and for a moment looking slightly less terrifying. His light green eyes glowed in the candlelight as he gestured me forward to be embraced by the baker bunch. Look at her, fellas. She's nervous. Doesn't know if she's up to baking seriously. His English accent wasn't posh but Cockney. I took a deep breath and smiled back at him. I never knew I was supposed to be pimping my pin. Yeah, I'm a little intimidated. Those are sick. He laughed and grabbed my shoulder, pulling me into the space that they'd opened for me. Don't worry, he said in a low voice. We only have to put on a show 3 times a year. We can't let the butchers think that we won't poison them if they step wrong. Butchers are a lot of hard-headed idiots. The stronger the butcher, the more stubborn and stupid. We have to be stubborner and stupider. He laughed again and patted my shoulder, but gently. He didn't feel like a butcher. It wasn't uncomfortable and intense like it was with other butchers. You really did join our little gang. Is it living up to your expectations? I swallowed and whispered. That depends what you have to eat. I'm starving. He turned and gestured to the top table, a small square with only one person standing behind it, a man with long dark hair falling over the shoulder of his long coat. CM, can we hurry it up? We're getting hungry. The CM only nodded and gestured to Orion, who was still standing by the door, arms folded over his chest. Orion caught my eye and gave me a flicker of a smile before he strode between tables up the 6 tiers to the CM. Orion stood in front of the table, bowed his head, and led all the butchers in prayer. The silence around his words was profound, like even the crackling fire went quiet, while Orion spoke. When he raised his head, his eyes came back to me and I smiled at him. For a second, with him on the other side of the room looking at me, I felt like I was precisely where I was supposed to be, as weird as it was. Then we ate. And I will have to say that the exquisite food I'd been eating at Calder was nothing compared to the feast prepared by the finest bakers in the world, led by the immortal Landry. Not that he was actually immortal, vampire, and all that, but what did I know? There was something very vampiric about the way we sucked the life out of the butchers. I glanced over at Orion where he leaned against the wall beside the CM, watching over the rest of the butchers while we ate. After a few minutes, the Sim gestured him sharply to sit beside him. Orion met my eyes, and for a moment I wanted to tell him no, that I would run down to the kitchen and make something for him because he was my butcher, but I managed to resist the impulse. He sat and slowly ate, still eyeing me as if to say that this is not what he wanted in his mouth. I faced forward, gripping my fork because everything had happened too quickly. I wasn't used to Orion looking at me like that in public, as though he didn't care what anyone else thought of me, of us. "Try the duck," Landry said, forking me an enormous drumstick. I smiled slightly, and then suddenly all the bakers were suggesting the best dishes, piling bits of this side and that sauce, this cut and that delicacy, until I had 5 plates in front of me. I started laughing. It was too much, but at the same time it felt like a hug. A lot of hugs, and every single bite was the best thing in the world. While we ate, butcher boys and a few older butchers performed feats of grace and agility like aerials and backflips, or waved fire around as they danced about the bonfire. Apparently butchers liked fire and long hair. I studied the butchers on the top levels closest to the walls. They were all so different. Some were really old, older than my dad had been. There was one particularly scarred man who didn't take any pleasure in the feast. He stared around as though there were traitors among us. The butchers around him left plenty of space. "Who's that?" I whispered to Landry. "Marlowe. He's less nervous now than he was 20 years ago." That was possible. Strange. I caught Sebastian staring at me and gave him a slight smile. He lifted his goblet in my direction. I raised mine, but less enthusiastically. I was still a little bit furious with my brother. More than a little bit. But he was my brother, the only family I had left. No, my uncle. Vincent sat at one of the tables furthermost from the bonfire with Aunt Lottie sitting beside him. She looked strangely at home in the black high-collared blouse, clutching a knife as she carved her roast duck. She turned to Vincent and smiled before she said something that got a flash of smile from him. This was their family. "They're proud of you," Puffer murmured as he leaned over to refill my glass. "I know they're not the most demonstrative couple, but they're proud as punch. With you too." I nodded at him and tried to smile, but seeing them happy made me miss my parents. Lottie and Vincent hadn't tried to be proud of us before we'd been accepted by the butchers. My mother, what would she think of this? She'd kept this world from me, leaving me unprepared. No, she'd taught me to take energy from my dad and bake it into things for Sebastian. She'd taught me without my knowledge until I'd somehow become so awesome. Everyone said so. Feeling a little bit sick, I pushed my plate away and stood. Landry stood with me, and the rest of the bakers soon followed. "I didn't mean to," I trailed off as Landry put his hand on my shoulder. "We must prepare for tonight's hunting," Landry announced. He leaned over to me. "This part might be slightly uncomfortable for you, but you'll get used to. I've been looking forward to tasting your brother." "What?" He stepped ahead, linking my arm with his, so I trailed behind him. With his other hand, he slid his fingers over the skin of the butchers at the nearest table. He walked slowly, giving the butchers plenty of time to move their hair aside to reveal the skin of necks or roll up sleeves and raise their hands, exposing their forearms. Landry's hand slid over skin and his body began to hum. I could feel him, feel the energy he soaked from the butchers with complete indifference to which butcher's energy he took. He headed towards the table where the CM had already revealed his neck and both forearms. How much skin did he need? A lot, apparently, because every single baker touched him, drawing his strength into them. But Landry, who glanced at me and nodded me ahead to touch the CM. "I'd rather not," I whispered. The CM looked up at me, surprised and amused. I saw that expression on Orion's face sometimes. It was strange to see it on someone else. Violetta. He stood and the bakers took their hands off him. He extended his hand to me. Welcome to Candlestick Manor. It is your home as long as you will stay. I glanced at Orion where he sat beside the CM. He looked tense. What was I supposed to do? I didn't want to touch another butcher, not like that. But it would be really rude not to shake his hand when he opened his home to me. My mother hadn't raised me to be rude. I tentatively took his hand, but I felt nothing other than warm skin. There was no rush of energy and happiness like I felt with Orion. I let out the breath I was holding, smiled genuinely, and said, "Thank you." Stepped back in the direction of Orion, and the other bakers pressed around him again, all but Landry, who had abandoned our group to circle around to Sebastian. I watched the scene, Sebastian aware of the baker stalking him, standing stiffly while he waited as Landry got closer, and closer and closer. Nerve-wracking, isn't it? Orion whispered in my ear. I jumped a little bit, then shook my head, smiling. Is it? Landry didn't touch you. None of the bakers have. They're still pecking the eyes out of your dad. We're a bunch of vultures, apparently. Landry finally got to Sebastian, who hastily tilted his head forward and pulled down his collar, but Landry went for his face, pressing his palms to Boss's dark cheeks. Bess arched, gasped, and I gasped with him. I took one step forward, and Orion slid his hand around my waist, pulling me back against him. Landry can be terrifying. I believe that's him punishing your brother for betraying the butchers and becoming a renegade. Don't worry, Tansetta will remember it fondly. My brother went boneless, slumping down to the table. I turned in Orion's arms and found his face close to mine, so close. Is he unconscious? No, just relaxed. Landry is very efficient at taking energy out of butchers. After some time you'll become more efficient as well. I cocked my head. Are you saying that you don't like the way I take your energy? He bit his bottom lip, sharp white teeth that should be pressed against mine. I am saying that I didn't like the CM touching you. I'm saying that I don't want another baker to touch me. I'm saying. He grabbed my hands and squeezed my fingers as he lifted them up to his lips. He pressed his mouth against them. I felt a rush of life flow into me, more and more as he stared into my eyes above my hands. I gripped him back, swaying towards him while his energy filled me. I wanted more. I needed more. Orion's lips were hard on my knuckles. When Landry touched my shoulder. Enough, Violetta. You wouldn't want to bring our fearless butcher to his knees. Or perhaps you do, but probably somewhere private where you can take advantage of him more thoroughly. I pulled away from Orion, but he hung on for a moment, his eyes melting into me before he let go and straightened, lips soft and delicious. My knuckles buzzed from his kiss. Are you okay? I asked Orion, fisting my hand in my skirt so I wouldn't touch him again. He smiled at me, a slow, languid smile that reminded me of waking up in his warm bed. Violetta, I am much improved. I'll be even better after you feed me. Whatever your delicious hands prepare. This is the part where Landry takes you to the kitchen. Do you mind? You're safe with him. I promise. Safer than she is with you. Are those teeth marks in her knuckles? Landry murmured. Come on, love. Let's get cooking. I let Landry lead me away, down the wide tiers to the broad floor around the bonfire that still snapped and danced. As I went, butchers looked at me with what I would have called hunger. I stopped meeting eyes and hurried after Landry and Chapter 2. Butcher. She's staying in your old room, the CM said to me, looking tired as though a horde of hungry bakers had sucked the life out of him. They'd repay him though soon enough. I nodded and put my hands in my pockets. None of the other bakers had touched me. I wasn't sure why. Landry had made certain Violetta barely took the edge off my reserves. I wanted to give her more, so much more. You will not be staying in your old room, my father added as though that point needed clarification. Landry insisted that she stay in the tower, because it's the most defensible place in Candlestick, but also insisted that you hand over your keys. He held out his hand as though I had the old keys to the back door and the key to my bedroom on me. I sighed as I took my car keys out of my pocket and removed those keys from my keyring. It's almost as if you didn't trust me. He smiled slightly. I don't, but I know that a few keys aren't going to keep you from seeing her. You can scale the wall with your eyes closed and she will let you in the window. She's lovely. He added that last part with a slight frown. I frowned in return. Yes. The other butchers. He glanced around at the hungry butchers waiting impatiently for the baker's goods. I agree with Landry. She needs protection. What she did last night was nothing short of miraculous. Whoever set up last night's debacle won't be happy about her. I nodded. While she's baking, I'm going to track the werewolf, the one that infected the boys. My father's face tightened. That is the priority. Marlowe tracked the dog as far as Border Town. You should ask the local pack leader to be your escort. I frowned at him. He seemed to enjoy throwing me and my dead-to-me brother together. Of course, it was the most logical thing to do. Armand could get things out of a werewolf no butcher ever could. Also, take Sebastian. I raised my eyebrows as I glanced to the huge man who was slumped in his seat, looking dazed and dull. His first encounter with a rail baker. Landry left him mostly unresponsive. I'm not sure I'll be able to get anything out of him. My father smiled and stood, pushing back his chair. He walked over to the baker's table where they'd left the remains of their meal. I couldn't remember the bakers being so quick at any other feast, but of course Violetta had tried to leave, and once one left they all had to go. They were like a pack of sheep. Dangerous, fanged, clawed, vicious sheep that fed on the wolves. None of the other butchers dared to take anything from that table, not unless a baker specifically said so. There were rules. Bakers ate first. Butchers ate what bakers told them to eat. Nothing more, nothing less. I wanted so much to eat nothing other than what Violetta fed me, but I settled for the plates the CM offered me, and eating from one as I walked through the tables, even though Violetta hadn't taken very much strength out of me, down the wide tiers to Sebastian. I put the food in front of him and he fell on it like a starved puppy. Good. He still had strength to eat. Not that Landry would really suck the life out of him. Landry was precise in everything he did. If you can walk, come with me. Eat on the way. I turned and nodded to Marlowe before I took the 2 freshly filled plates. A butcher boy brought me that the CM had sent from his place on the top tier. The CM hadn't touched a bite. This was official food for an official job. Sebastian stood and barely wove on his feet before he grinned at me. What do I call you? Boss? Master? Class president? That tone of voice, the slight mocking with his twisted lips. I was going to have to be very patient. Not that I wasn't perfectly patient with my butchers, but he was starting from scratch without the years of following orders and obtaining the discipline necessary to be an effective butcher. And he was very gifted. He would be arrogant, careless, then learn some lessons and be less careless for a little while until he forgot again. That's what trainees did. And he was my trainee. Orion will be sufficient. Daughtry, if you can't pronounce my first name. Turned and walked out quickly. The sooner we got this taken care of, the sooner I could return and taste Violetta's baking. What would she make for me? I sniffed the air, but I couldn't smell anything besides smoke from the fire. Trying to smell my sister? Would I have to get used to him talking? I wasn't really big on talking. Her baked goods. I didn't like the way you did that, kissing her fingers like you were about to bite them off. We were in the hall and walked beneath the bright chandelier. She didn't object. Of course not. The great Orion Daughtry can do whatever he wants. I glanced over at him, his contemptuously curled lips beneath his pale green eyes, Violetta's eyes. Can he? He sounds like a lucky guy. I turned and shoved him against the wall, my forearm at his throat while I stared him down. Do not address me in the third person. I dislike it. As you've just noted, I get what I want. What I want is not nearly as important to me as what she desires. Your sister. She is my baker. I will allow you to talk of her because she is your sister, but be very careful what you say. Marlowe made a sound just to remind me that he was there because he didn't care if I beat the puppy into submission or not. I pulled away from Sebastian and took a vicious bite out of the duck that I could have sworn was on Violetta's plate. Could I taste her lips on them? Imagine that I did, but it was probably wishful thinking. The food was very good. The best. The bakers always got the best, not that they needed it. Out of respect. We needed to make certain our bakers were happy because an unhappy baker didn't make good bread. I wanted to make Violetta very, very happy, and not just for her bread. We left the house and I walked the few steps to vault into the car. Sebastian hurried after me, graceful in spite of his long limbs. It still startled me to Look at him and see his transformation. He was an excellent specimen of butcher, or he would be if I had the patience to train him properly. Tansetta. Always knew how to stretch my patience. Marlowe nodded at me before he headed into the garage. He'd already given me the address where he'd left the trail. Can we play some music? Sebastian asked after a few minutes of silence.
No.
He scowled at me, petulant and annoyed. Why not? I kept my face smooth instead of scowling back. We are hunting a werewolf. It's essential that one's mind is free from distractions. He made a rude sound. It's not music that's distracting you. It was so difficult not to snap at him. Focus, I droned, starts before the task you set out to accomplish. Clarity of mind begins with purity of heart. I saw the way you look at my sister. I wouldn't call it pure. I glanced at him, then back through the windshield. My hands held the steering. Well, far too tight. I analyzed my feelings, the anger, the frustration, the desire. I had to ignore the truth of his words because he laced them with aggression. Truth was truth. I did not run from anything uncomfortable, even that. Perhaps that's why I crave silence. I have found it difficult to focus ever since meeting your sister. I haven't struggled so much in my role since I first accepted the calling. He was quiet for a minute. Why are you doing it? Isn't it dangerous to be with a baker? Olivia was telling me how stupid it was, but you wouldn't do anything that put Vi at risk, would you? My jaw tightened in spite of him finally sounding earnest instead of derisive. Most of the dangerous outcomes between butcher and baker being romantically involved come from lack of discipline and support. Landry and the CM are determined to protect her, even from me if necessary. That gives me some peace of mind, but I still worry. It's not entirely safe. The more energy she draws from me, the more I want her to take, and the hungrier I become. The danger is actually far greater for me than her. That's a comfort. He laughed and shook his head. So, she could drain you completely until you were dead. I nodded. And you like that? Very much. You're sick. I frowned at him. Referring to my mental health crosses the line. I can't allow you or any butcher to disrespect me. If you had become a baker, you could call me whatever you want. You chose to become a butcher, so know your place. He grinned at me, his white teeth bright against his dark skin. That's almost tempting, draining you like Landry did to me. I apologize, Master Orion, leader of butchers and second to none. I'm second to the CM. He rolled his eyes. Are you always so literal? You must bore Violetta to death. Boredom is not the risk she faces in my company. If you are bored from talking with me, you could consider silence as an alternative. Open your mind. Concentrate on your senses, particularly smell, but others as well. If you can, be aware of energy, it helps a great deal with tracking. He sighed but shut up and seemed to be sniffing the air as we drove with the top of my black Corvette down. Maybe I was boring. I didn't really know very much about what interested Violetta. She'd either been pretending to be her brother or pretending to be a girly girl, so I didn't suspect her. I cleared my throat. I'd worked so hard to shut him up. Sebastian, what does your sister like? He opened his eyes and looked at me, a slow smile working over his face. I did not like that smile. She loves being told what her place is as a woman, and that it's in the kitchen. I raised an eyebrow. Landry's sister is a baker, but all the other bakers I've met are men. I'm afraid I haven't got a chance at pigeonholing her that way. Pity. What else? He frowned at me. You really want to know? I gave him a short nod. I'll tell you something about her, but you have to give me something in return. That knife, he said, nodding at my belt where I wore a very nice dagger my mother had given me for my 11th birthday. I removed it and tossed it to him. There's an armory at Candlestick Manor. You can check out any number of weapons for any amount of time. You're really going to enjoy that part of being a butcher. He grinned at me as he ran his thumb along the blade. Yeah, I am. Violetta is a pain about things like honesty, duty, discipline, and she always follows the rules. That's why I couldn't believe she'd ever take my place at Calder. She must have hated lying to everyone. She despises being lied to. She likes honesty, probably because she didn't get much of it. When I discovered my dad's cache of weapons and started practicing with them, my dad took me aside and explained about the natural urges of a boy to kill things, which isn't natural for the record. None of my friends' parents had weapons and none of them wanted to throw knives at cats. After I'd asked half a dozen friends about their parents' weapons, my parents finally brought me in on the whole hidden world. My dad helped me hold a weapon, not chop off my own fingers. That sort of thing. I wasn't allowed to talk to Vi about it. My mother was an awesome, super sweet lady who never raised her voice, but at the idea of Vi knowing about that world, she totally lost it. I've never been so scared in my life. I swallowed. Honesty? I lied about knowing she was a boy for a long time. But she was lying to you, so it probably didn't count. But from here on out, you lie to her, she'll hate you forever. She seriously knows how to hate someone forever. She's mad at me right now. Yeah, I shouldn't have left her without a butcher. I didn't say anything because if he said it, I didn't have to. No, he shouldn't have left her without a butcher. But if he hadn't, I wouldn't have met her and we wouldn't be where we were. I blinked, which was at the exit I had to take. I veered over tires, screeching, crossing 2 lanes to make the exit. See, I said, pulling up at a stoplight. Distractions are dangerous. I really needed to focus. Tracking was not just scent. It was more following. Intention, getting inside the mind of your prey, and the scent or a track was only validation to prove you were on the right trail. I drove slowly through the city until the streets were shabby, north until I got to the old lot behind the rundown brick building Marlowe had given me the address for. Hopefully the wolf Marlowe had entrusted the site to hadn't forgotten what he was doing and marked it all up. After a minute or two, Marlowe pulled into the lot on his motorbike. Sebastian and I got out of the car to meet him. Armand materialized from the deep shadows inside, arms across his chest. Took you long enough, he snapped, eyes bright and golden. It's a holiday. Let's cut the charming chit-chat short. Is the wolf who infected my boys one of yours? I asked. Armand cocked his head and showed me his teeth. I'd actually trusted him to guard Violetta last night. I must have been out of my mind. My pack doesn't usually have a death wish. The trail leads this way. He nodded to the side and started at a quick jog. I followed, my boots thumping, while Armand's made no sound. I thumped louder for a little while just to make the differences between us more apparent. Armand glanced at me and smiled sharply. Trying to wake the dead? Marlowe grunted. Are you sure this is the right trail? Did you have some of your boys track it already? I can't sense anything from the original. Armand sneered. They aren't my boys. I'm not a butcher. Otherwise I'd be stomping along like Mr. Daughtry. Marlowe, how is the rheumatism? He grunted and jogged along, but he didn't look particularly pleased to be there. Not that he'd ever complain. I slowed down and fell in beside Marlowe. I'd like you to circle back and check around the building for a sidetrack. I'm not sure I trust that wolf to lead us. He grunted and turned on a dime, heading back where we'd come. He didn't slow down. I shook my head for a moment before I stretched my legs to catch up with Armand and Sebastian. We were an odd group of runners in our black coats, except Armand, who wore jeans and a t-shirt, managing to look disreputable with his unshaven chin. Butcher trying to take care of Marlowe? How touching. I growled at Armand. He laughed, flashing his grin in my direction again. You smell like vanilla and jasmine. Must have bathed in it this morning. I'd taken a shower after I'd spent the night watching Violetta sleep in my bed. I growled again. You're talking about my sister? There was a warning in Sebastian's voice. Armand glanced at him with a flash of curiosity before he smirked back at me. 2 for the price of 1. What an excellent deal. Looks like this one's a bit of trouble, but not nearly as much as her. I spun around on him. Is this a new tracking technique you're developing? You can't keep your muzzle shut, I'll close it for you. Permanently. He grinned and crouched. Is that so? Seems like you're all mouth. I swung at him slow and high. He dodged easily and blocked my kick. I spun around and slammed my shoulder into his chest, knocking him back into a brick wall. I hadn't fought him in a long time. Felt so good. He twisted beneath me and brought his elbow up in a move he'd taught me when I was 8. I laughed as I hooked his knee, and we both tumbled to the pavement. He punched my face and I returned the favor, but stayed away from his mouth. Talk about mouthy. All those teeth. His eyes never shifted, but he was laughing when the fight finally left me and I rolled away from him and into a crouch, breathing heavily. And that's why we don't let him wander off on his own, Marlowe said in a dry, bored voice. I looked over at him where he stood beside Sebastian. You're back. Did you find another lead? He shook his head. This is the trail. Without the pack leader to throw off the scent, it was easy to trace our wolf. Sebastian stood there clenching and unclenching his fists while I wiped blood off my mouth. I inhaled deeply. Excellent. Shall we? I continued in a jog, letting Armand lead the way. He moved light and springy. Werewolves were so springy. Sebastian fell in beside me. What was that? He muttered under his breath. Perhaps so Armand and Marlowe wouldn't hear. Was he sparing my feelings? Butchers shouldn't lose track of their goal so they could fight with an ally. It wasn't like me. He helped us last night. I said like that explained anything. Yeah, so that means you fight him? I didn't kill him. I didn't even pull a knife. Werewolves fight as a sign of respect. He ran alongside me for a moment. I almost killed him. You didn't look like you needed help, but you let his teeth get so close to your face. Did I? I've had werewolf teeth much closer. It's not the face you need to worry about but the throat. I'll be sure to remember that. It's fine if a werewolf bites my face. So good to know. He shut up after that, but I was left wondering what that had been. We'd fought and wrestled like a couple of puppies. I couldn't trust Armand not when he was a werewolf. He'd abandoned me and everything I fought for and believed in. But he felt like my brother. He felt like he missed me as much as I missed him. I shook my head and focused. The scent grew stronger and stronger until it was stifling and mixed with another smell I knew very well. We ran along the river's edge past a row of nondescript gray storage buildings. The scent drew us on, and even Sebastian's nose was wrinkled when we turned the corner between buildings and stopped spread out, knives ready as we moved towards the gray bundle in the middle of the alley. For a moment I thought it was the old grizzled wolf from down south, but it was smaller, younger, and it was hard to tell anything else about the creature that had been ripped to shreds and mostly eaten. I stopped moving, as did Armand and Sebastian. Marlowe continued to the body, head extended as he sniffed. I've never smelled that kind of monster before. There've been vampires around here, maybe, drawn by the blood, but they didn't stick around. I walked forward, staying away from the body while I crouched and brushed the ground with my fingers. Or it's a vampire that's gotten very good at not looking like one. A vampire that eats werewolves. Sebastian glanced at me. Mel had been controlled by a vampire. Why would a vampire want to look like a werewolf? Could be crazy. Lots of crazy vampires, Marlowe said drily. That would explain the eating. Sebastian took another step closer, then turned and left, walking briskly out of the alley. I frowned after him, then looked at Armand. Can you identify it? No. I've memorized the teeth of our pack for identification, and this dog is not one of mine. Are you going to check on the puppy? He's fine. This death reminds me a lot like the way his parents were slaughtered. I stared at Armand and muttered a curse under my breath. Think of something interesting to tell me when I get back. I turned and walked back towards the river to find Sebastian crouching beside it after having thrown up. Charming. I crouched next to him and handed him a handkerchief. You've seen gore. You're a butcher, so blood shouldn't bother you. You have instincts deep in your DNA that you haven't learned how to harness. Whatever you're thinking or feeling is important, relevant, and possibly helpful. Don't shut down the emotions. They'll shut themselves down soon enough. Talk. He glared at me, his bloodshot eyes confused and disoriented. I don't know. Just felt lost. So lost, betrayed, and hopeless. I felt like I failed the most important thing I've ever tried to do. I nodded. Good. Did you feel the weight of responsibility? He nodded and blinked back, tears in his pale green eyes. I failed. I put my hand on his shoulder and felt it, the emotions, the weight, the agony of failure far eclipsing the pain and fear of imminent death. The wolf's death. Sebastian had managed to soak up the emotions of the werewolf's last moments. Fantastic. You're reliving his death. That happens sometimes with butchers. It's not pleasant but extremely useful. I blame Landry for this. He's extremely good at preparing his butchers for exactly what he needs them to do. He glanced up at me. His butchers. I smiled and pushed up from his shoulder, then hauled him upright. Landry. would disagree, but the CM would not. Armand says that this is very similar to the way your parents died. I spoke without hesitation, like it wasn't a horrible thing to say. He had to want to get to the bottom of their murders as much as I did. Unless he felt responsible in some way. Would that explain his emotions, his being so attuned to this murder? Did he know this murderer personally? You're saying that I worked with my parents' killer. He still sounded unbalanced and unstable from the victim's emotions. I raised my eyebrow. I'm saying that Armand thinks that this killer might be the same as the one that killed your parents. If you feel guilt for going about avenging their deaths all the wrong ways, that's something you need to face and deal with. In my eyes, you're a butcher's boy, and you're going to have to prove your dedication just like any other, but I don't hold your decision to become a renegade against you. He studied his hands for a moment, opening and closing his enormous palms. Why not? You're right. You warned me that I'd be fighting to undo all the damage I'd done, and I did. I'm really worried about the seal. I rubbed my chin. What did the CM tell you about it? He glanced at me and I sighed. You didn't tell the CM. He shifted uncomfortably. I'm not used to being a butcher, to feeling the heaviness, the duty. I always wanted to be a butcher. I wanted to feel normal. To not be alone, to have a family, but I didn't expect to feel responsible. That's why I don't hold your past against you. The butcher in you has awakened, and you will feel the call to slay the darkness in this world and inside of yourself. We all have our demons, our regrets, and it doesn't get easier that you started with such regrets. I shook my head. I trust that you'll do your part. The butchers need you. When we get back, I'll talk to the CM with you about the seal. He inhaled shakily and nodded, but made no move to stand. I put my hand on his shoulder for a moment and felt that connection before I headed back into the alley to examine the grisly body. We got back to Candlestick Manor later than I'd hoped, but when I went into the kitchen, Landry had a lovely stack of cold pancakes waiting for me. Pancakes? He shrugged. She was exhausted after making this lot, so I sent her to bed. You'll eat these, go butchering, then come back in the morning and let her take your energy. I hesitated. If she was exhausted, I should go to her now, give her my strength at that very moment, and perhaps stay with her through the night. Blinked and shook my head. I had so much to do, not the least of which was encouraging Sebastian to talk to the CM about the broken seal. Sounded pretty ominous, but I didn't know anything about it. I knew that darkness was drawn and captured into the area north of the city, that butchers had been called to protect humans from and contain these shadowlands. I didn't know all the technical aspects. That's what CMs were for. I didn't want to get involved in this sort of thing. Armand was the one who my father had been preparing as the next CM, not me. I shrugged, inhaled the pancakes, which were officially my favorite breakfast food, even if I ate them at 8 p.m. I got up and went to find Sebastian, to drag him to my father. That wasn't too bad, actually. My father took over the difficult task of keeping Sebastian from talking about the wrong things and making certain that Sebastian felt balance between guilt and responsibility, so he told what he knew instead of holding it inside, buried beneath guilt. The CM made it sound like breaking seals wasn't all that big of a deal, but I knew him, and by the tightness in his eyes and the way his smile strained, this was a bad thing. A very, very bad thing. Sebastian talked about following the cloaked leader into the North City, past the occupied lots to where it was nothing besides overgrown cars and random walls that hadn't yet gotten knocked down. They'd gone down into a cellar in the middle of a field where there must have been a former house, and then through the cellar down and down through these natural caverns until they were in underground caverns with sloping walls and stalagmites. It was creepy. The creepiest part was where Sebastian and Tony cut their hands and let their blood drip onto this big copper lid that looked like one of those city water facility caps. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. Sebastian actually said that, and the CM didn't groan or put Sebastian's head on a pike. The CM laughed instead, which was much worse, but Sebastian didn't know that. Those old seals have been around for generations. It's about time we updated them, don't you agree, Orion? I hesitated because if my father asked for my opinion, that usually meant that he was going to make it my responsibility. I said, what do you think, Sebastian? Should we look into improving the efficacy of those old-fashioned plugs? He nodded and smiled like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Glanced at the CM and he smiled at me. Here it came. Orion, you'll lead the research on the seals and figure out how to make a new batch even more impermeable and resilient to tampering. Sebastian, walk with me. What kind of weapons are you most comfortable with? I was excused, so I left, half irritated and half amused. I buzzed from energy. I shouldn't have eaten all those pancakes so quickly, but I was worried that someone else would eat them while I chatted with the CM. I wanted to go up the stairs and pace outside her room, but that wouldn't really be research, and I was the butcher before anything else. The pancakes had tasted heavily of cinnamon. I'd noticed that cinnamon usually meant tracking. Wasn't an exact science, but I'd been eating goods for a long time. Cinnamon would sharpen my senses and strengthen my endurance for long runs over wide stretches. I would bet that after tonight's battle with the darkness, the CM would send me further afield to find the origins of the wolf. I wasn't leaving until I'd touched Violetta and had her feed me with her bare hands. Waking up to her jello in her fingers was something I desperately wanted to get used to. Maybe, just maybe. Chapter 3. Baker. I woke up, and for a moment I wasn't certain where I was. Smelled like incense and Orion. My mouth watered in spite of me. I sighed and sat up, pushing back the black sheets. I was in Orion's old room. The night before, I'd climbed the steps behind Landry, listening to his tour. The bathroom was down the hall, the other rooms in the tower unused these days. I'd be alone up here, he'd assured me, his pale green eyes intent. His eyes, they were so much like Sebastian's, and he treated me kind of like family. Was he related to my dad? Maybe that was the missing gene, the reason for the green eyes. What was I doing there? Obviously I couldn't stay at Calder School for Boys now that my brother had come out of the closet, so to speak, but seriously, I could never be one of those pin-wielding bakers, all tough and scary, who actually belonged in some kind of medieval castle cooking for vampire slayers. I'd stayed awake for a long time with the light on, staring up at the black cross that hung above Orion's childhood bed. I'd left the light on all night, with one of the knives from the wall under my pillow. It wasn't paranoia. Only it were. I'd done a lot of thinking without Orion's melting brown eyes to scatter my thoughts, without his presence to chase away the fear. The fear wasn't going away, but maybe I could do something useful with it. I shook away the thoughts and walked over the bare wood floor to the mirror that hung above the table, morning light slashing across the gray stone from the narrow window across the room. I examined my reflection, the borrowed blue striped pajamas rolled up at my wrists and ankles, my face worried with a frown creased between my pale green eyes. It was still me, though. Still the same old Violetta Tansetta with a unruly short hair and dark skin, not as dark as my mother's, but I had her mouth. I tried but couldn't ignore the cut on my cheek, although it looked much better this morning. Landry had given me something to put on it when he handed me the plastic-wrapped PJs. Good morning, I told my reflection. She smiled at me and looked happy and cheerful, how she was supposed to look when everything was falling apart, and she stayed up at night listening to her mother cry over her sick brother. He wasn't dead, but she was. I blinked rapidly, trying to get rid of the tears in my eyes. I didn't have time for tears. This was the first real day of my new job. It was just a job, just a chance to earn some money before I went to school and started my real life next fall. If I thought about it like that, I might not break down in hysterics in front of Landry or the CM. Orion's dad. I couldn't think about Orion without my mouth watering and my stomach tightening. How long had he known I was a girl? Why didn't he say anything? Why didn't my brother or my mother? I frowned at the mirror. Why didn't my mother want me to be part of this world? I had to take this slow. Had to understand what I was getting into before I committed myself to any course of action. I told Orion that I wanted to be his baker and keep kissing him. I rolled my eyes at myself and turned away because I did not want to look at my lips and think about how many times they'd been pressed against Orion's. Was not a pastel girl who got all weak and ridiculous at the sight of a pair of pectorals, even if they were the perfect shade of whipped cream infused with caramel. I swallowed and shook my head. It wasn't Orion, it was the energy that I got from him. Wasn't it? Was it? How could I possibly be certain how I felt about him when my need for his butcher strength was impossible to separate from my attraction? Not that there wasn't more than that. I knew Orion and respected him. He was kind of a bit aloof, dutiful in the extreme, intelligent, encouraging and unflinching in the face of danger or tears. He didn't love Olivia and he liked kissing me. It didn't matter. I couldn't just run around kissing him until after I'd figured out exactly what my life was and how he fit into it. No more kissing. Orion. I needed to learn to take energy without it getting all tangled up in kisses. Nodding, I opened the door and gasped when I saw Orion leaning casually against the wall across the hall. He smiled, his cinnamon stick lips curving sweetly. I swallowed while my heart pounded. I'd really decided not to kiss him? I better have a really good reason. Good morning, Violetta. Did you rest well? I fiddled with the rolled-up cuffs of my pajamas. Yes, thank you. How did you sleep? He grinned widely and shook his head, long hair swinging around his face, his cutting cheekbones, eyes like melting pools of chocolate. I haven't. I have too much energy to sleep. Will you take some before I have to go to class? I hesitated. I'm in my pajamas. He glanced down at them. Very nice. They don't quite fit, do they? I brought this over for Sebastian. He was exhausted after our werewolf hunt and then the nightly battle against the darkness. He nodded to the blue suitcase at his feet without taking his eyes off me. Thank you. I quickly went to it, but he already swung it up over his shoulder. Where would you like it? I moved away from him, stumbling backwards. He was too big and beautiful, dreamy and delicious. I can carry my own suitcase. He shrugged but didn't put it down until I led him back into the room, pointing to the wall beneath his knives. He put it down without the slightest thump, then turned to me. Where's the knife? I blinked at him, then glanced at the wall and the spot of bare stone where the knife I'd borrowed for the night had been. I went to the bed, took the knife from beneath the pillow and turned around, almost chopping off Orion's head. Because he'd followed me. He leaned back barely enough to not get his throat slit, put his hand over mine around the handle and turned it this way and that. Before he smiled at me. Good choice. Sharp blade, good balance, and small enough to fit perfectly in your hand. Do you know how to throw knives? My heart pounded from him being so close, from his bed being behind my knees. I blinked at him and shook my head. I'm better at cutting things than throwing. He nodded seriously like I wasn't talking about vegetables. I was. The only person I'd ever cut was myself on accident. Do you want to throw knives together sometime? Like a date? I blurted. He smiled slightly, the curve of his lips ridiculously delicious. My own hand began to warm beneath his as his energy soaked into me. Yes, like a date. He frowned and pulled his hand off mine, rubbing his chin. That's not a good date, is it? No, you'd like something less martial. What about the botanical gardens? There's beautiful color in the trees this time of year. I hesitated because I wasn't kissing him, but this thing, taking it slow, getting to know him as a butcher and me as a girl, might work. I'd be an idiot not to try and figure things out with Orion. You owe me a date to the botanical gardens. He raised an eyebrow and his eyes dropped to my lips, reminding me of a conversation we had a long time ago when I'd been pretending to be a pastel girl. Were we going to make out there? Oh, we were. How embarrassing. Was that what he meant? Do I? Perfect. Let's start with that. He hesitated, then backed away from me. From the bed, turning to walk purposefully towards the door. Once he'd gotten there, he turned around, standing outside as if he were a vampire that needed my permission to enter. I clung to the knife and tried to calm my thumping heart. He wasn't a vampire, but they were out there somewhere, monsters who would rip me apart like they'd torn up my parents. Orion was used to this life, used to waking up to danger, but I wasn't. Orion, is Sebastian safe? He nodded decisively. He's as safe as someone with his penchant for idiocy can be. He fights well, has excellent reflexes, and actually seems to want to learn and improve. I frowned at him. Yes, Sebastian could be incredibly stupid, like joining renegades with Tony, but he was my brother. That's good. He's not really stupid, he's just always distracted. He smiled, a slow smile that warmed his eyes. All right. You seem different today. I swallowed. I do. Because I usually threw myself at him and kissed him first thing in the morning. He nodded. I was going to have to be strict with myself so that nothing got out of control, but you are keeping your distance. It makes it much easier for me, so thank you. I think that we should take it slow. I'm really looking forward to getting to know you as yourself, as a beautiful woman who happens To be the greatest baker I've ever met. I smiled up at him, feeling kind of shy in my ridiculous pajamas. I was thinking that we don't really know each other very well, and this whole world. I gestured around aimlessly. It's a lot. I have a million questions. He tilted his head and took a step towards me before he blinked and stepped back. What are your questions? I licked my lips. I'd opened the door to go down the hall to the bathroom. This was not the time for him to answer a million questions. Maybe 3. Do you know why my mom didn't want me to know about this world? He frowned thoughtfully, crossing his arms over his chest like he was considering the question very seriously. It made me smile, him being so official business about it. It's not easy to be a female baker around so many male butchers, particularly a gifted one like you. The transfer of energy is always a pleasant sensation, but with a beautiful woman it can be more than that. Inexperienced butchers might take advantage of a baker. Some see the strength of the butcher and think that he's the power, the main component, but without his baker the butcher is nothing. To become part of the team. He gave me a rueful smile. I wonder if I took advantage of you. I always enjoyed touching you far too much. I bit my bottom lip. In school sometimes butchers had touched me even when they thought I was my brother. It hadn't been comfortable feeling the energy when I didn't want it. So I really do have to learn to throw knives to keep butchers in line. He exhaled heavily. It wouldn't hurt. The real risk isn't butchers though. The real danger is always the darkness. If Landry was killed, my father would be devastated, personally as well as professionally. It would be a blow to all butchers. We protect our bakers first, the rest of the world second. Have there ever been any attempts on Landry's life? As though summoned by his name, Landry's pale face appeared over Orion's shoulder. Morning, children. Orion, you're behaving. That's a surprise. Yeah. Violetta, do you mind if I call you by your first name? Landry's my last. My first name's Terrence. Didn't like it as a teen, beat up Orion's dad when he called me that to my face. It's been Landry since. Yeah, we've had the odd vampire or werewolf who thought it'd be a pleasant fate to die trying to kill me, but we bakers are tougher than we look. He grinned at me, his green eyes gleaming, scarred knuckles visible where he crossed his arms, the same pose as Orion actually. You look tough, I pointed out. He glanced at Orion, who stepped away from him. She saw you suck the life out of her brother last night. Landry, you look like a psycho killer. He shrugged. What are the two of you discussing? Why your mum didn't want you up in this baker life? I nodded, but it felt awkward. No offense, you seem great and I think you look much more like an angel than a psycho. But my mother wasn't irrational. Not telling me about this world is so much more dangerous than preparing me for it, so why wouldn't she? Landry studied me for a long time as getting bright and kind of hard. She was my intern a long time ago. She had a lot of potential. When she told me that she was finished with this world, she didn't tell me that something happened to her, but I imagine something did, whether it was men or monsters. I do know that we lost a good baker that day, and I am determined that the same thing won't happen to you. If you decide that being a baker's not your life, no harm. Your mum created a beautiful life, and I'm sure you can do the same as a baker or otherwise. I studied him. Was there something he wasn't telling me? Probably. Also that beautiful life she created ended by being slaughtered by werewolves. I gripped the knife tighter. You knew my mom? He nodded short, hard. Very well. Time's getting on. If you suck some of the energy out of this strapping lad, we can get on our way. Come on, dearie. He won't bite. I guarantee it, at least while I'm watching. He cuffed Orion's head, and Orion shook it slightly, but then he smiled at me. And I felt a little bit like the room tilted, so I couldn't help but stumble in his direction. I hesitated in front of him. Is it okay? My fingers ached to touch him, to slide through his hair and over his skin. Landry's here. It's official butcher baker stuff, nothing to feel awkward about. I raised my hands, but I wasn't sure where to touch him. He stepped forward. Suddenly, slid one hand around my waist, pulling me against him while his other hand slid behind my neck, skin against skin while he stared at me. My own hand slid up his neck to press the skin of his cheeks, my fingertips brushing his eyelashes. He was so warm, strong, delicious, and perfect. I wanted to kiss him. My lips ached from not touching his. The way he looked at me, I wasn't the only one aching. I soaked up his energy until I was encapsulated in his warmth and Strength. I leaned closer, almost kissed him, but instead ducked my head and pressed it against his chest. His arms tightened around me and I felt perfectly safe and at home. It's going to be okay, Violetta, he whispered low. I will protect you as long as you let me. His energy flowed into me faster until I was cocooned in his glowing goodness. Enough. Landry's voice seemed to come from far away. Orion growled and held me closer while I nuzzled my face against him. Suddenly, Orion jerked his arm up, pushing me back while he spun around, terrifying and furious at Landry. Landry patted Orion's cheek and shook his head, then tucked a knife back into his pocket. I knew that pulling a knife on Violetta would get your attention. You're going to have to be much better, Orion, or no cookies for you. Orion was breathing heavily, still blocking Landry from me. Cookies? I asked. Landry smiled at me. That's right, dearie. You're going to bake Orion cookies. Today. So many different kinds. He's going to be very spoiled if he goes to school like a good little butcher. Orion snorted and turned to smile at me. Landry's cookies are very good. Yours will be better. He raised his hand, almost touched my cheek before fisting it and shoving it into the pocket of his black jeans. My mouth is already watering. I'll see you soon. He turned and left me with Landry, my heart pounding and my skin aching for one more touch of my chocolate man. Landry stooped to pick up a knife, the knife I must have dropped in my eagerness to get my hands on Orion. He made a sound and then handed it back to me. His eyes met mine and I smiled cheerfully, trying not to act like that had been weird. Hadn't been, not really. That felt right, perfectly, unutterably right. The only weird thing was Landry standing there observing the whole thing. Okay then. I'll get dressed and be down in a bit. Cookies sound great. Landry nodded at me thoughtfully. If it doesn't, don't be afraid to bake something else. You mustn't ignore your instincts. You know what he needs. You've been drawing on his strength, so you're attuned to him like no one else. His mouth twisted. You may not want to, but you'll have to learn how to draw strength from other butchers. Not only for practical reasons but for the sake of defense. Bakers aren't vulnerable, but only if we're well trained. I can touch a vampire and suck the life out of him in an instant. Prefer to chop their heads off. Vampire energy makes terrible cake. He made a face and I laughed. Okay, you're right. I should figure out this energy stuff without Orion. He cocked his head and studied me. I thought you'd argue about that. It's not going to be comfortable for you to connect with another butcher, not when your connection with Orion has always. He trailed off and coughed. That is you. Like him. Makes it easier to connect. You need to learn to connect with those whom you despise. I forced a cheerful smile. Sounds like a challenge. If you don't mind, I'm not going to wear the black outfit today. It's not clean and it's not my style. He took a step back. We have already ordered your own uniforms. I highly recommend that you dress in uniform, but until your own arrives, do as you like. He gave me a last smile, pulled the door closed and left me staring at still having to go to the bathroom. That day I worked harder than I ever had in my life. I poured my energy into batch after batch of raisin applesauce cookies, with way too much cinnamon. Tasted each batch and each batch was good but not quite right. More cinnamon. And something else. I went into Landry's back room, where crates of onions and potatoes lined the wall while herbs hung from the blackened beams. Inhaling deeply, I stood in front of the enormous chest where he kept his weird spices and exotic ingredients. I opened drawer after drawer, inhaling deeply until I finally found the right one. I took a spoonful of the pink powder, turned and would have dumped it all over the floor if Landry hadn't grabbed my hand and the spoon, keeping it steady. What have you got there, dearie? I shrugged. I have no idea. It smelled right. He nodded. That's powdered flamingo feathers mixed with dried salmon flakes and desiccated squid membranes. Looks like Orion's off on an adventure. I looked down at the powder, then sniffed it, analyzing it for smell instead of rightness. It did smell a bit fishy. What would that do to the cookies? Nothing good. And yet, I mixed in the powder, only putting a pinch in the next batch. I had no idea how Orion would eat that many cookies, but I kept making them like I couldn't stop. I should be learning how to make something interesting from the master baker like biscotti, but I was caught in the spell and couldn't escape. Landry, what do you mean about Orion being off on an adventure? Asked, mixing in another pinch of flamingo feathers. That mix is for crossing unknown terrain. Not only tracking like the cinnamon, but traveling long distances and remembering his way home. I frowned at the dough in the bowl, pulling away from the sides just the right amount. It was almost ready to put on baking sheets. Shouldn't I put some protein in it then? Nuts. He shrugged. Don't overthink. Just then the back door opened and 3 butchers came in. Olivia and Francis were escorting a manacled Mal. Olivia looked at me, flinched and glanced away. Where do you want him? Francis asked Landry, nudging Mal forward. Mal stepped in with his nose in the air, staring straight ahead of him as though he couldn't see anyone else. Sit down, Malvolio. Good lad. Olivia, take off those cuffs. Francis, take these cookies. Don't eat any of them. Orion will be very grateful. I glanced over at Francis where he was juggling 4 containers of cookies. Isn't Orion coming here? Francis grinned at me. Oh, he's here, but he's shut in with the CM. What do you want with the vole, Landry? Landry smiled at Francis and lifted a butcher knife. You know what curiosity does. Get on then. Olivia, you stay. Sit by Malvolio and stop looking like you're too good for all of us. Violetta, sit down here. He pulled out a chair, facing the bench where Olivia and Mal sat, Mal avoiding staring down at his wrists where Olivia was still taking off his restraints. Mal looked so strange, a little bit flushed, and then he glanced up at Olivia, and then away as though her beauty were too much for him to bear. He liked her. Olivia met my eyes for a moment, then they became bright and angry. She did not like me. Now, Violetta, which of these butchers do you like least? I turned to look at Landry. He shook his head. Dislike them both the same? Very well. We'll start with Olivia. Take her hand. I stared at Olivia's hands where she held them in fists over her tight black jeans. I hesitantly reached out, then pulled back and turned to Mal. I covered his hand with mine before I could think about it. I sat there for 5 minutes staring at my hand over his, trying to take his energy, but I couldn't feel anything. I poured so much energy into the cookies, so I could have used his life force, but I couldn't seem to do anything. Finally I shook my head and pulled my hand away. Nothing. Olivia sneered at me. Maybe you should kiss him. Olivia, it's your turn. Would you like her to kiss you? Landry asked in an amused voice. Olivia glared at him, then straightened up and turned to face me. Give me your hands, Violetta. She didn't wait but grabbed them and placed the palms over her cheeks. Her dark eyes were angry, but I felt a flicker of life from her. Anyway, she jerked away with a gasp, putting her hands to her face. Not bad, Landry murmured, patting my shoulder. Try Mal's face then. I hesitated, but Mal matter-of-factly took my hands as Olivia had done and pressed the palms to his cheeks. He hadn't bothered to shave for a few days, and although he gazed over my shoulder instead of meeting my eyes, I did feel a flicker of something from him. He did not pull away, simply closed his eyes. I followed suit and slowly began to draw Mal's life into me. Took so much effort. The moment I thought of Orion or my brother or werewolves or anything else, the energy would fade. Suddenly, the door opened with a clatter and all of us looked up to see Orion, with a scowl on his face. His anger was directed at Mal. Why was he so angry? Orion, Mal murmured, sounding like a kicked dog, but looking down ashamed, pulling away from me. Landry, why is this creature touching my baker? Landry stood and hefted a marble rolling pin as he advanced on Orion. Didn't you get Violetta's cookies? You have a mission. Orion took a step towards Landry as though he didn't care what Landry said. How can I leave, Francis taking my place with Sebastian as second while you're allowing a butcher who's been infected to touch my beloved? His voice was low, but that last word shot straight into my heart. Landry wanted me to learn how to take energy from butchers I didn't like quite so well as I like you. I stood and went to move between Orion and Landry. I smiled at them both as though we were having a civilized conversation. It's very difficult. Landry makes it look so easy, and with you, it's always been as natural as breathing. Where are you going? Will you be gone long? Orion walked over to me and hesitated before he carefully brushed my arm with his fingers. Not long. I'm sorry for interrupting you. It's only that Mal is the one who poisoned me, and he would never intentionally harm me. Landry takes too many risks with you if he's allowing you to be so close to someone who may be programmed to hurt you against his will. He let his hand fall. Before I'd drawn a drop of energy from him, I reached for him, then pulled back. clasping my hands in front of me instead. How could he poison you against his will? Mal's voice was clear and arrogant. Apparently, I've been bewitched by a vampire. He's right. I'm not to be trusted. Of course, with Olivia and Landry. Here you are not in danger. Using me to train you is an intelligent choice. Orion could see that if he thought about it for a moment. Who better than someone once trusted who is now the enemy? A vampire? I whispered, staring at Orion. Mal was under the influence of a vampire and now Orion was leaving me? It was fine. I wasn't there for him. Was just learning about this interesting world, and I'd been up thinking that the two of us needed distance. This was great. Perfect. My stomach nodded its objection. He gave me a stiff smile. The plot thickens. Werewolves and vampires plotting to destroy Calder, and yet vampires are not the friends of werewolves. He stepped close and encased my arms in his hands, the fabric of my shirt keeping his energy from soaking into me. Perhaps Olivia can teach you to throw knives while I'm away. I chewed on my bottom lip, then smiled at him. Sure. That way I can hit something when we go on our date. He raised his eyebrow. 2 dates? I have so much to look forward to. I'm not supposed to give you my energy before I leave. He clenched his jaw, the muscle twitching before he exhaled and forced a smile. I'm sure that Landry will allow no harm to come to you. I trust him with my life, so why is it so difficult for me to trust him with you? He leaned close and brushed his lips over my forehead. Be careful. Be very, very careful. He bumped his forehead against mine as he gazed into my eyes. Just a moment's contact, but I felt the flash of happiness and energy from those little touches. Do you think that Mal is really infected by a vampire like the werewolf? Boys, can he be cured? He studied me, then gave me a slight smile. He's in no risk of becoming a vampire. Brainwashed isn't the same as infected. It doesn't last forever. He's probably perfectly safe. I just don't like taking risks with you. I grabbed his hands, holding on to him for a moment while I struggled to find the right words. When do you think you'll come back? He studied me while his fingers gripped mine, his strength flowing into me. He was so beautiful. I wanted to stare at him forever. Violetta, I don't know. Maybe a week. I inhaled sharply and gripped his hands tight. A week? You're leaving the first day I came to live at your dad's house for a week? Why? He swallowed and moved closer to me. I need to track the wolf who broke into Calder. Why you? Don't you need to stay here and do all the paperwork on the couch? He smiled wryly, letting go of one hand so he could brush my cheek. Without you playing the violin for me, it's not fun at all. No, I'm the one who has to go. The CM insists that it's the best thing for me, and you'll have the chance to get used to Candlestick Manor without me to interrupt you constantly. I thumped his chest. But why you? He sighed. I'm taking 2 werewolves with me. The CM thinks I'm the butcher, least likely to be eaten by them. I swallowed hard and stepped up to him, fighting the need to wrap my arms around him and forbid him to do something so dangerous. Are you joking? He smiled gently at me. No, there are allies. I'll be perfectly safe. I frowned at him and poked his chest with my finger. You're telling me to be careful when I'm going to be behind stone walls with an entourage of assassins to protect me, but you'll be perfectly safe going hunting with werewolves. I'll be along with him. Nothing's going to eat him besides me. I turned to see Armand where he stood beside the door Orion had come through. The one that led to the house, not the back door. Armand seemed more like a backdoor person to me. Why are you going with him? Armand shrugged. I was offered something I want. I scowled at him, then turned around and grabbed the nearest bowl, started cracking eggs into it and in general making a mess out of Landry's ingredients. Don't move, Armand. Orion, sit down. Landry cleared his throat, but I turned and glared at him. He raised his hands in surrender and gave me a beatific angel smile. 20 minutes I had them wait for the batch of biscuits I made for Armand. Hardly knew what I put in them, my hands moved so fast, but I grabbed his wrist before I gave him the plate. You will protect Orion even if you're not a real butcher anymore. Promise me. His eyes narrowed as he nodded his head. I swear that Orion will return to you in one piece. Now give me the goods. I rolled my eyes and let him snatch the plate out of my hands before I brushed the flour off and turned to Orion. I shifted because maybe that whole thing hadn't been very professional. Or maybe not really great potential girlfriend behavior. He only smiled at me, the sweetest, loveliest smile I'd ever seen. My heart pounded and he took one of my hands, flour gritty beneath his thumb. Thank you. Watching you bake reminds me of who you are, what you are capable of. Trust in you. You are my baker. He lifted my hand, pressed a kiss hard on the back of it, so hard I might have a bruise, but I didn't mind. I wanted to feel his lips pressed to my hand for as long as he was